The workshop smelled like motor oil and old steel, a scent that had become my religion over 47 years of turning wrenches and coaxing life from dead engines. My grandfather built this place in 1962, passed it to my father, who handed it down to me along with calloused hands and the belief that honest work could fix anything broken in this world. Duke, my German Shepherd mix, lay stretched across the concrete floor, his greying muzzle resting on crossed paws as he watched me inventory another estate auction hall. At 72, I should have been fishing with my grandson Tommy instead of dragging home rusted metal, but something about that particular Saturday auction had called to me like a siren song I couldn't ignore. The auctioneer had barely glanced at Lot 47 when he rattled off his practiced spiel about miscellaneous aircraft parts from the Henderson estate. Most folks saw scrap metal and walked away, but I'd spent enough time around old planes during my brief stint in the Air National Guard to recognize the skeletal remains of something special. The corroded aluminum panels, oxidized beyond recognition, told a story that nobody else seemed interested in reading. When the bidding opened at $50 and nobody raised a hand, I felt Duke's ears perk up beside me. He had this way of sensing when I was about to make what my late wife Margaret used to call my leap-before-you-look decisions. $55 later, I owned what appeared to be the scattered remains of a World War II-era aircraft, though the identification plates were too corroded to read clearly. The other bidders shook their heads as I loaded twisted metal and fabric scraps into my pickup, probably thinking the old mechanic had finally lost his mind. Duke jumped into the passenger seat with the dignity of a co-pilot, his amber eyes reflecting the same curiosity that had driven me to bid on what others saw as worthless junk. Margaret used to say that Duke and I shared the same stubborn gene, the one that made us believe everything deserved a second chance. Back in the workshop, spread across every available surface, the pieces began telling their story under the harsh fluorescent lights I'd installed when my eyes started failing me in dim corners. What I'd initially mistaken for random aircraft debris revealed itself as something far more specific and precious. The wing ribs, though twisted and green with oxidation, bore the distinctive manufacturing marks of North American aviation. The fabric scraps, preserved in patches where they'd been protected from moisture, showed the silver dope finish characteristic of trainer aircraft from the early 1940s. Duke circled the perimeter of my archaeological site, his nose working overtime as he catalogued scents that spoke to some deeper instinct about the significance of what we'd brought home. My grandson Tommy stopped by after school that Tuesday, his backpack still slung over his shoulder as he navigated the obstacle course of aircraft parts that had transformed my usually organized workspace into something resembling a museum storage room. At 16, he possessed the kind of boundless curiosity that reminded me of myself at that age, before the weight of responsibility and loss had taught me caution. He picked up a section of aluminum tubing, turning it over in his hands with the reverence of someone handling a holy relic. The serial numbers, barely visible beneath decades of corrosion, caught his attention first. Tommy's fingers traced the stamped digits while Duke positioned himself between my grandson and the workbench, as if understanding that we were dealing with something that demanded respect. The boy's knowledge of military history, fed by countless hours of documentaries and online research, made him the perfect partner for unraveling the mystery we'd inherited from the Henderson estate. Together, we began the painstaking process of cleaning each piece, using wire brushes and naval jelly to strip away the oxidation that had hidden crucial identifying marks for decades. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, when Tommy discovered a data plate hidden beneath layers of paint and corrosion on what appeared to be part of the instrument panel. His excited shout brought me running from across the workshop, my arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement as Duke scrambled to keep pace. The plate, no larger than a business card, bore the faded but legible markings that identified our collection of scrap metal as the remains of a North American AT-6 Texan, serial number 4284756. But it was the additional marking, partially obscured by corrosion, that made my heart skip a beat and caused Duke to whine softly, sensing the shift in emotional energy that had suddenly charged the air. Research consumed my evenings as I dove into military records and aviation databases, following digital breadcrumbs that led deeper into the aircraft's history than I'd initially expected to travel. The AT-6 Texan had served as an advanced trainer during World War II, responsible for preparing thousands of pilots for combat operations in both the European and Pacific theaters. But this particular aircraft, according to records I found through the National Museum of the Air Force, had been assigned to something called the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, where it had played a role in training the men who would become known as the Tuskegee Airmen. The historical significance hit me like a physical blow, leaving me sitting in my desk chair at 2 in the morning, staring at photographs of young black aviators standing beside aircraft, identical to the one now scattered across my workshop floor. Duke lay at my feet, his steady breathing the only sound in the silent house, as I absorbed the magnitude of what we'd accidentally acquired. These weren't just aircraft parts, they were fragments of American history, pieces of a story about courage and perseverance that had been relegated to a Henderson estate sale and nearly lost forever. Tommy's research skills surpassed mine when it came to navigating online military archives and social media groups dedicated to Tuskegee Airmen history. Within days, he connected with historians, veterans' families, and aviation enthusiasts who helped us piece together the aircraft's service record. Our AT-6 had been used to train pilots, including Lieutenant Charles Henderson, whose family had apparently inherited the aircraft after the war and stored it in various barns and outbuildings for decades. The connection between the seller's name and the pilot's surname suddenly made the estate sale seem less random and more like destiny. The restoration project that began as a curiosity had transformed into something approaching a sacred mission, with Duke serving as our unofficial supervisor and quality control inspector. His presence in the workshop had become so constant that I'd installed a dog bed near the workbench, where he could monitor our progress without getting in the way. Margaret used to say that Duke had better intuition about people's intentions than most humans, and I'd learned to trust his judgment when it came to evaluating the visitors who began stopping by as word of our project spread through the local aviation community. The mockery started subtly, with sideways glances and whispered comments at the hardware store and coffee shop, where local gossip traditionally took root and flourished. Jim Fletcher, who ran the auto parts store on Main Street, made it his personal mission to remind anyone who would listen that I was wasting my time and money on a pile of worthless scrap metal. His nephew worked at the regional airport and apparently considered himself an expert on aircraft restoration, having attended a 2-day seminar on sheet metal repair techniques. Fletcher's campaign of discouragement intensified when he learned that I'd invested nearly $3,000 of my retirement savings in proper restoration materials and specialized tools. He took particular pleasure in calculating the cost per pound of the finished product, comparing it unfavorably to the price of scrap aluminum, and suggesting that my late wife would have been ashamed of such fiscal irresponsibility. Duke's reaction to Fletcher was immediate and unmistakable, with hackles raised and a low growl that spoke volumes about the man's character and intentions. The workshop became my refuge from the growing chorus of critics who seemed personally invested in predicting the failure of our restoration project. Each morning, Duke and I would review the previous day's progress before diving into the meticulous process of fabricating replacement parts, straightening bent components, and researching historically accurate paint schemes and markings. The work demanded patience that I'd developed over decades of automotive restoration, but also required new skills in aircraft construction techniques that challenged my 72-year-old brain in unexpected ways. Tommy's enthusiasm never wavered, even as his friends began questioning why he spent his afternoons in a dusty workshop instead of playing video games or hanging out at the mall. His knowledge of military aviation history made him invaluable when it came to ensuring historical accuracy in every aspect of the restoration. Together, we pored over technical manuals, studied period photographs, and contacted museums for guidance on authentic color schemes and markings that would honor the aircraft's service record. The first major milestone came 6 months into the project, when we successfully mounted the restored engine on its rebuilt mount and heard it turn over for the first time in decades. The sound of that radial engine coughing to life filled the workshop with a thunderous roar that brought neighbors running to investigate the source of the commotion. Duke's reaction was priceless, as he simultaneously cowered from the noise and wagged his tail with excitement, recognizing that we'd achieved something significant, even if he couldn't fully understand the technical implications. Word of our success spread faster than I'd anticipated, drawing visitors who ranged from genuinely curious aviation enthusiasts to skeptics who came to witness what they assumed would be an expensive failure. The restored AT-6 Texan, now wearing authentic Tuskegee Airmen markings and gleaming in historically accurate olive drab and yellow paint, commanded respect, even from those who'd initially dismissed the project as an old man's folly. Fletcher's nephew showed up one afternoon, his earlier confidence replaced by grudging admiration as he examined the quality of our metalwork and attention to historical detail. The transformation wasn't limited to the aircraft itself, as the restoration project had revitalized my sense of purpose and connected me with a community of people who shared my passion for preserving aviation history. Tommy had blossomed into a knowledgeable amateur historian, corresponding with Tuskegee Airmen veterans' families and contributing to online forums dedicated to keeping their stories alive. Duke had appointed himself the official greeter for visiting dignitaries, which included representatives from the National Museum of the Air Force and the Tuskegee Airmen Historical Society. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as Duke and I were preparing for another day of final detail work on the aircraft's interior restoration. Colonel Patricia Williams from the Air Force Historical Foundation had somehow learned about our project and wanted to discuss the possibility of featuring our restored AT-6 in an upcoming documentary about the Tuskegee Airmen's training program. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting results, but also the warmth of someone who understood the passion that drove projects like ours. The meeting took place in my workshop the following week, with Colonel Williams accompanied by a documentary filmmaker and a representative from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Duke positioned himself strategically near the aircraft, as if understanding that these visitors represented something more significant than our usual stream of curious neighbors and aviation enthusiasts. The Colonel's examination of our restoration work was thorough and professional, her military bearing softened by genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship and historical accuracy we'd achieved. What happened next exceeded my wildest expectations and validated every hour of work, every dollar spent, and every moment of doubt I'd endured during the 18-month restoration process. The Air Force wanted to acquire our AT-6 for permanent display in the National Museum of the Air Force, where it would serve as a centerpiece in their Tuskegee Airmen exhibit. The financial compensation they offered was generous, but more importantly, they wanted Tommy and me to participate in the aircraft's formal presentation ceremony, recognizing our contribution to preserving an important piece of American military history. The irony wasn't lost on me as news of the Air Force's interest spread through our small town, transforming the narrative from mockery to admiration overnight. Jim Fletcher, who'd spent months predicting the project's failure, suddenly claimed to have been supportive all along, conveniently forgetting his earlier comments about wasted money and misguided priorities. His change of heart might have bothered me once, but at my age I'd learned to appreciate victory without dwelling on the pettiness of those who doubted the journey. The presentation ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, with Duke serving as my honored guest and moral support as I addressed an audience that included active duty personnel, aviation historians, and families of original Tuskegee Airmen. Standing beside the aircraft that had once been dismissed as worthless scrap metal, I felt the presence of every pilot who'd trained in similar cockpits, every mechanic who'd kept these planes flying, and every dreamer who'd refused to accept limitations imposed by others. Tommy stood proudly beside me as we handed over the aircraft's keys to museum officials, his transformation from curious teenager to knowledgeable historian serving as proof that passion projects can change lives in unexpected ways. The restored AT-6 would now inspire future generations of visitors, carrying forward the stories of courage and determination that had made the Tuskegee Airmen legends. Duke's tail wagged steadily throughout the ceremony, as if he understood that we'd accomplished something worthy of the trust he'd placed in our judgment 18 months earlier. The financial windfall from the aircraft's sale allowed me to establish a scholarship fund for students interested in aviation history and mechanics, ensuring that Tommy's generation would have opportunities to pursue their passions without the financial constraints that had limited previous generations. More importantly, the project had reminded me that age doesn't disqualify us from taking on ambitious challenges or making meaningful contributions to preserving the past for future generations. Looking back on the journey from that Saturday morning auction to the museum ceremony, I recognized that Duke's unwavering presence had been the constant that sustained me through moments of doubt and criticism. His faith in my judgment, expressed through patient companionship and protective loyalty, had provided the emotional foundation necessary to see the project through to completion. Margaret would have loved watching Duke's reaction to all the attention and visitors, and I like to think she would have been proud of what we accomplished together. The workshop feels different now, quieter without the constant presence of aircraft parts and the daily rhythm of restoration work. Duke still occupies his favorite spot near the workbench, but his attention has shifted to new projects and possibilities that await our consideration. At 73, I've learned that retirement doesn't mean retirement from purpose, only retirement from obligations that no longer serve our highest goals and aspirations. The letters from museum visitors continue to arrive monthly, sharing how our restored AT-6 has inspired their own interests in aviation history and military heritage. Children write to describe their field trips to the museum, while veterans' families express gratitude for helping preserve stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. Each letter reminds me that preservation work extends beyond the physical artifacts to include the human connections and emotional resonances that give historical objects their deeper meaning and significance. Have you ever stumbled upon something that others dismissed as worthless, only to discover that it held value beyond anything you could have imagined? Sometimes the most meaningful discoveries come disguised as other people's discarded dreams, waiting for someone with enough vision and persistence to recognize their hidden potential and bring them back to life.